Good evening and welcome to the UCLA Sociology Department's Spotlight Sociology series. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of the Division of Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at UCLA. It's been over a year since our country and the world have been radically altered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of you working in your offices may remember the day you left to begin working from home. For UCLA, it was Friday, March 13th, 2020. And of course, March 13th, Friday the 13th is a day to remember. To begin what for many of us thought would be a brief time before we went back to normal. Since then, we will have experienced the deadliest pandemic since the 1918 flu pandemic, a nationwide death toll of 573,000 and 32.2 million coronavirus cases in the US alone. We have also experienced the fastest vaccine development in the history of vaccines, with 3 highly effective vaccines currently being administered in the US. Today, almost half of all adults in the US have received at least one COVID-19 shot, and about 30% of the population has been fully vaccinated. Without question, we are living through unparalleled times. In a moment like this, as we look back on our lack of pandemic preparedness, we turn to sociology, in particular, medical sociologists, to study the implications on society of future pandemics and superbugs, and how current priorities and dynamics of our for-profit healthcare system have profound consequences on the health of our nation and the world. My sincere thanks to Brad Burnam, a UCLA sociology alumnus, for agreeing to speak today on this important topic. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Abigail Sagi, Chair and Professor of the Sociology Department.
Thank you, Dean Hunt. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our 3rd Spotlight Sociology event. This series expresses our department's deep commitment to public sociology while providing an opportunity to showcase our world-class faculty and students. This evening, we will focus on superbugs, turning a sociological spotlight on this important and timely topic. Today's event features one of our esteemed alumni, Bradley Burnam, whose pioneering work in biotech intersects with the department's expertise in health and society, in conversation with sociology professor Stefan Timmermans. Stefan has been a professor in the department since 2005 and served as chair of the department from 2011 to 2015. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, his MA from sociology from the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, and his BA in sociology from the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven in Belgium. Stefan is the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including the 2019 Leo G. Reeder Career Award for Distinguished Career Contribution to Medical Sociology from the American Sociological Association. Drawing from medical sociology and science studies, Stefan's research uses ethnographic and historical methods to address key issues in the for-profit US healthcare system. He conducts research on medical technologies, health professions, death and dying, and population health. Alumnus Bradley Burnam received a BA from our department in 1990 and holds a master's degree from Stanford University. Brad is founder and CEO of Therapeutics, a nationally recognized pharmaceutical and medical device organization specializing in advanced wound and dermatology products. Once a victim of a severe antibiotic resistant infection, Brad was inspired to develop permafusion, a revolutionary delivery system based upon a first of its kind fusion of liquid and oil that enabled him to create Tern's first product offering, which dramatically reduced his need for additional surgeries. Brad's unique entrepreneurial story has been featured on Bloomberg and Fox Business News and in publications including Forbes magazine. Tonight's topic, Superbugs, Hindsight is 2020, will expand on how scientists have been warning for years that we are even less prepared for a potentially deadlier series of superbugs, antibiotic resistant bacteria. We have more bugs, yet fewer drugs than ever. Will we learn from our mistakes and prioritize antibiotic development irrespective of economic returns? In conversation with Stefan, Brad will orient us to the role antibiotics have played in the development of modern medicine, as well as contextualize the failure to prioritize antibiotics in a broader socio-political context. Drawing upon industry and sociological perspectives, Brad will discuss the consequences of an imbalanced reimbursement system, lack of venture funding for antibiotic development, and regulatory hurdles that have placed a dangerous kink in the antibiotic pipeline. Let's welcome Brad Burnam and Stefan Timmermans for what promises to be an enlightening conversation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. It's a tremendous pleasure to spend an hour with you today. We have an amazing guest, and Brad, to just orient us. So you graduated from UCLA 20 years ago exactly, and I imagine you as a sociology major taking classes about sociological theory, sociological methods, and a whole series of interesting topics. And then here you are, you're the CEO and founder of a pharmaceutical company. So that seems quite a journey. Like I say to students that sociology is a key that opens many doors, but the door you opened is really remarkable. So can you tell us a little bit of how you got from here, UCLA, to where you're at now?
Sure, I appreciate the introduction, thank you. It's definitely been a while since I've been there, but actually I'm looking forward to coming back to campus. Well, it's been an interesting learning experience to connect via video. I miss people. So I look forward to seeing everybody again in real life. I would say my story, like you said, is a little bit of a series of unlikely events. I graduated UCLA with a BA in sociology in the year 2000. At that point in my life, I really only knew what I loved to do, which was to teach. I absolutely love teaching. I enjoy the education process. In particular, I had an extreme interest in learning differences among students, how we could teach people that learn differently, acquire information differently, and communicate them differently. I went to get my master's degree in education at Stanford, where I wrote my thesis on sort of an alternative theory behind attention deficit hyperactive disorder and different ways that we might be able to work with those students. And I decided to continue in a PhD program actually at UCLA in the psychology department. I did not finish that PhD program because about halfway through it, I really needed to go out and work. It was just not a situation where I could continue studying, although someday I'm hoping to pound on UCLA's door to let me back in and complete a PhD, most likely probably under your tutelage. I ended up in the medical device world because neuromodulation at that point, which is implantable devices that work on the brain on things like obesity, epilepsy, we're starting to get into mental disorders. And it also was a pretty good career. There was a decent living to be made in it. I spent a little bit of time in the neuromod division before watching a defibrillator implant, which is the internal cardioverter defibrillators that they put in patients at risk of sudden cardiac death. And the representative in the room that I was sort of shadowing, he hit the induce button, which is when they sort of put the patient into a deadly fibrillation. It shocked him out of it. And I was like, that is the most macho thing I've ever seen. So I switched into cardiac devices and I spent about a decade there. And I loved it. It was an unbelievable amount of work. I was on call. I worked 7 days a week from 5 a.m. until midnight, but it was a good gig and I got to do what I love to do, which is interact with patients and be a little bit like my dad, who was a doctor, or still is a doctor. While I was working, I was in the hospital a lot. I was one of those reps that spent time in the operating room, went into patients' rooms, interacted with them. And we've all heard the term hospital-acquired infection. And if we haven't, it's a bug that you pick up in the hospital while you're visiting or while you're staying there. I woke up one morning and this ear, which looks normal after a number of surgeries, was actually twice its size than it currently is. It was completely black. The color had spread into my face and it was terrifying. So I rushed to the hospital, met my dad there, an infectious disease specialist, who said, you need to have emergency surgery, you need antibiotics immediately. This is a really, really bad infection. And it's spreading into the nerves and potentially into the brain area. So I was in the operating room that day. A good friend of mine, luckily had a surgery center nearby, and he opened it up and he ended up putting about 50 stitches around my ear, cutting chunks of my earlobe out, removing a giant abscess behind that. I apologize to anybody who's watching this at dinner time, by the way, it's a little graphic. And I spent the next 6 weeks on that first surgery, going to the doctor every single day, including weekends, and having the wound packed, which is where they have to actually, put gauze in it and take it out, and put gauze in it and take it out. But as horrible as that sounds, it became years of recurring infections. It just kept coming back, because when these bugs sort of, I'll just say, implant themselves in your system, they give off biofilms, and they leave little babies behind, and they're microscopic. So it's very hard to take them all out, and it just kept coming back. And throughout the process, I was looking at the tools they were using on me, and there was just sort of this desperation in me to try to figure out a way that I could stop having so many surgeries. And one of the tools that they used every single time I was there to pack the wound was Neosporin. And I said, why isn't the Neosporin helping? And this doc, who is a brilliant doctor, he's a plastic surgeon, but honestly, one of the best, doctors that I know. He said, well, Neosporin is basically just there to grease up the area and make it more comfortable. It turns out Neosporin, and I still am fascinated by this notion, it was never actually FDA approved. And I bet a lot of people listening to this probably don't know that. It was released in about 1948. It was grandfathered into some old rulings that, under like the first aid monograph, they call it at the FDA. And it just became this reflex that we use. It's at the checkout stand, it's on the aisle. When you have a cut, you should just put some Neosporin on it. But it was never FDA approved. So there was never any proof that they had to submit to the agency to show this actually works against infections. Now, it may have back in 1948, but times have changed. And furthermore, we're the only country, or at least that I can find, that treats Neosporin as an over-the-counter product. It's still an antibiotic. Treating an antibiotic like first aid, and we'll probably get into this later, but just forgive me just one tangent, has always been just this crazy notion to me, because it's like saying I have an earache, I've got a bottle of penicillin in my medicine cabinet, I should just take one penicillin and hopefully it'll go away. So that's how we've been using Neosporin. So it wasn't helping me, and I decided to make my own product. I started ordering chemicals, probably breaking every customs law on earth without even realizing it at the time, barrels of petroleum, disinfectants and whatnot. And I found this ingredient from Europe called PHMB, which is a liquid antiseptic that's very uncommon in the US, that I wanted to figure out a way to get into a petroleum base. And we talked about that process, permafusion. That took about 200-300 tries to figure out a way to fuse this liquid antiseptic into a petroleum base and give me a product that felt like Neosporin, but actually had the killing power of all the antiseptics on the market, but it didn't hurt the tissue in the process. And that first product became what we now call Hexogen, which is the foundational product that began Turn Therapeutics. It's led to a number of other products, ranging from eczema products to collagen products for chronic wounds to post-surgical dressings, and it's been a wild ride. So here we are.
So it's absolutely fascinating. So you are actually a poster child of the power of antibiotics and the power or the dangers of antibiotic resistance. Do you want to tell us a little more about both the good and the bad of the antibiotics?
Well, antibiotics, I mean, you're absolutely right. Without them, I wouldn't be here. If I had been taken to the doctor back in the early 1900s, they would have pronounced me as having something called blood poisoning. They would have just started chopping off pieces of my body and saying, there's nothing we could do for this guy. But antibiotics are an absolutely fundamental part of life, but a lot of people don't really know what antibiotics are. So could I take a moment to sort of explain what they are? So it's important to make the distinction that we didn't actually invent antibiotics, we discovered them. They're natural compounds, which is actually really common in medicine. Aspirin, for example, is a plant. Botox is a natural compound, although I wouldn't recommend going out there and looking for it. Those were the dented cans that our parents warned us about as a kid. Bacteria actually compete with each other for resources the same way animals do. And they have an arsenal of tools that they use in this competition. An example is, bacteria X might have a specific enzyme that works well against a basic staph infection. Staph aureus is kind of the common term that we hear. I have a staph infection. So if we're a pharma company and we're searching for a compound that might work well against staph, we're going to look for that bug which has a very effective tool to fight staph. Then we are going to harvest that tool and we are going to put it in pill form, run a bunch of clinical trials, and hopefully take it to market. It's actually what happened in the penicillin story. The mold on the bread, you remember that story, I'm sure, that Alexander Fleming saw on his dirty workstation actually had a ring around it because the penicillin bacteria, the mold was a bacteria called penicillin, was protecting itself from the other bugs around it, sort of infiltrating it. And it had developed a good tool to fight off the bugs that were trying to get to it. So it was defending itself. So he harvested it, ran it through clinical trials to see if it was safe enough to be administered as a medicine, and it was. And that's what gave birth to penicillin. Actually, just as far as how far we've come on production, they couldn't synthesize, gene sequences back then. So it's not like they could look at that penicillin bacteria and figure out how to make an exact copy of it, which is how we can do things today. They actually had to grow the mold and juice it. So it took 2,000 liters of mold juice to treat one patient with penicillin, which is just a fascinating notion. That's actually what gave birth to big pharma, that what we know in modern times as big pharma. So that's what antibiotics are. As far as how they changed our life, I think the life expectancy in the early 1900s, what was it, like late 40s, 45, 47, something like that. Now I think it's like 78 to 83, depending on female or male. People today, they die of cancer or heart disease. Back then, they died of infections as a result of injuries, getting gored by an ox or shot on a battlefield, or hurt in the factory that they worked in after the Industrial Revolution. They didn't live long enough to actually die of heart disease or cancer. They died of infection, and that all changed when antibiotics came around. It was a miracle drug. I think the life expectancy very quickly went up by 8 to 10 years. And it was as if in modern times, somebody had developed a pill for curing cancer.
Yeah.
It was a wild time.
Indeed. Yes. And that's, of course, coincided with a lot of other environmental interventions, such as better sewage system, better milk production. But I know that antibiotics and penicillin in particular is really critical. Actually, there are historical stories of physicians who went through that transition and described how patients that they knew for sure would die would be able to walk out of the hospital, and their enormous astonishment at being able to do something for these patients.
You actually know the story of the guy who got the first dose of penicillin? You know how he hurt himself? So he was a policeman. I can't remember. I think his name was Alexander also, but I can't remember his last name. And you'd think as a policeman, he probably would have been injured and gotten his infection by something in the line of duty. The pictures are actually quite graphic. They had to amputate his eye, his head was covered in sores. He scratched his face on a rose bush while gardening.
Oh, wow.
So if you think about how small of a, you want to call it an injury that was, without antibiotics, those kind of injuries could kill you.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we are potentially on the era, a new post-antibiotic era is terrifying, because we would probably have to change our entire lifestyle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No more gardening of roses anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Or hanging Christmas lights or mountain biking.
Yeah.
We need an amputation risk, with that antibiotics.
We really need the mountain biking though. So what about antibiotic resistance then? How does that fit into the picture? When did that arrive?
So antibiotic resistance is something that's always been there. It's a natural process. So those natural tools that the bacteria have to fight each other, one of the other things they do is they adapt to actually fight against those tools. So it's a natural process. We accelerated it as humans by harvesting those tools and exposing tons and tons of bacteria to the defense tools against them. But remember, bacteria are very simple organisms. They do three things: adapt, survive, and multiply like crazy. Actually, I have some crazy stats I'll always remember. A single E. coli, which is the bug we hear a lot about, people getting at fast food restaurants. I think it's on some of the menus actually. Replicates itself 69 billion times in 12 hours, just one. And every one of those 69 billion, 1.5 million will already be resistant and change its genetic code to whatever the local threat is. So then those 1.5 million will of course keep reproducing in the same logarithmic format, 69 billion per bug. And if they've already passed down that resistance gene, that's how it gives birth to an antibiotic resistant organism. So I like to speak via example. Let's say somebody has a urinary tract infection and they give that patient, it's a pretty common antibiotic like Levaquin. I think that's common to use for UTIs. If you take not enough Levaquin, which is why they always say take the full dose. When the doctor gives you, the whole course, take the whole thing. If you take not enough Levaquin to completely annihilate those bad bugs, the E. coli, just enough to expose it, you're teaching it. And then those bugs will then develop a Levaquin resistance in their genetic code, replicate, and then get out in the environment by any number of means. And then at that point, we have a strain of Levaquin resistant bacteria. But this isn't something that we weren't warned about. I mean, Fleming got the Nobel Prize in 1945 for the discovery of penicillin. Penicillin came out in 1943. By 45, there was already widespread penicillin resistance. In fact, in 1960, we came out with methicillin, which was a replacement for penicillin. The same year, they were already finding methicillin-resistant staph, MRSA, we've all heard that bug before, in the environment. This happens quickly. It's like leapfrog. Actually, I copy-pasted this quote from Fleming's Nobel Prize acceptance speech. Just something that I've always been pretty amazing when you think about. This is the guy who discovered penicillin and got the Nobel Prize, who found the mold on the bread, getting the Nobel Prize for it. And here were his final words. But I would like to sound one note of warning. Penicillin is to all intents and purposes non-poisonous, so there is no need to worry about giving an overdose and poisoning the patient. There may be a danger, though, in underdosage. Again, this is 1945. It is not difficult to make microbes resistant to penicillin in the laboratory by exposing them to concentrations not sufficient to kill them. And the same thing has occasionally happened in the body. The time may come when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself, and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant. Here is a hypothetical illustration. Mr. X has a sore throat. He buys some penicillin and gives himself not enough to kill the strep bacteria, but enough to educate them to resist penicillin. He then infects his wife. Mrs. X gets pneumonia, is treated with penicillin, and the treatment fails. She dies. Who is primarily responsible for Mrs. X's death? Why, Mr. X, whose negligent use of penicillin changed the nature of the microbe. Moral, if you use penicillin, use enough. So it boggles the mind when you think about the fact that a tool was introduced to the world that dramatically changed life expectancy by a decade, almost instantly. Like I said, it's like having a cure for cancer. The man who discovered it warned the whole world at his Nobel Prize speech, don't abuse this stuff. It's going to cause problems. And 80% of all prescriptions in use in the US goes into livestock. 50% of prescriptions in healthcare are unnecessary. We have completely abused these tools. And unfortunately, pharma has decided that they sort of don't want to play the game anymore because resistance happens so quickly because of that reproductive rate that I talked about.
Yeah, and this is also what makes antibiotic resistance also an interesting problem from a sociological perspective, is that for an individual, it doesn't necessarily have that many negative health effects to take antibiotics unnecessary. But for us as a community, as a society, it might have very devastating effects for the compromised person, elderly, baby, salesman in a hospital visiting patients. So it's actually this kind of situation where the individual is not really that much affected, but the collective is very much affected. So we have known about this since the early 1940s, as pretty much at the same time that penicillin came on the market. And so what have you been doing to heed these warnings from Fleming and others?
What have we been doing as pharma?
Or no, we or pharma, or as a society?
As a society, I want to say we haven't done enough. I mean, it sounds terrible to say we've done nothing, but we have not paid attention. Like I said before, resistance is a natural process, but we have absolutely accelerated it. We've developed very bad habits, because like you said, penicillin, Levaquin, Z-Paks, none of them can kill you when you take it. It feels like, well, you may as well take it just in case you need it. And that may as well take it just in case. My mom told me that in the past, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. All of our moms probably told us that. You've got a sore throat, take antibiotics just in case, you never know what it could be. That you may as well take it has potentially put a lot of things that we just have as part of our normal lives and things that we need, especially in the medical establishment, at risk. I mean, if we lost antibiotics, we would lose chemotherapy. I made a list the other day because you can't do chemo with antibiotics because their immune system is so taxed. We would lose implant surgeries like pacemakers or the pins holding my shoulder together. Before antibiotics, 3 in 10 children died of pneumonia. There's no reason to think that that wouldn't happen again. So what have we done as society? We have not done enough to heed the warnings. And pharma, I mean, we can get into this later in more of a discussion about the actual industry. They played the leapfrog game for a while. I mean, there were new antibiotics coming out, I don't want to say regularly, but at least consistently for a number of years. But it got to the point where there was a drug, fluconazole, pretty common drug used to prevent yeast infections. It got FDA approved in 1990. There was actually already resistance in the environment in 1988 just from the clinical trials.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
these bugs are fast. They remember some other stats. They outnumber all humans by 10 to the 22nd power. You know, they outweigh us by 10 to the 8th and some. I mean, it's kind of like asymmetric warfare. We really don't have a chance. So unfortunately, we have a very dry pipeline at the moment.
So right now, has pharma then given up on antibiotics, creating new antibiotics, or what can be done to reverse that move?
You know, this is of course a political topic. You know, have they given up on antibiotics? I will say that it seems as if they have gotten tired of the 70-year game of leapfrog, because there are also a number of other variables that stand in the way of having a for-profit company go after or spend hundreds of millions or even $1 billion on making a new drug that is probably going to be obsolete in a year. Add that to the fact that, you know, a lot of actually, let's just get into a little bit more of a political topic. This is a fun topic. So pharma, for the most part, is kind of seen as an evil industry, you know, especially in the United States. It's very much a US problem because obscene drug pricing, which I 100% agree is true, really only happens in the United States. In socialized medicine, the countries just say, this is what we're going to pay, and, you know, pound sand if you don't like it. But in the US, you know, we have a reimbursement driven market where a lot of choices to what they are going to work on, research and develop is going to be made based upon how much money they're going to make from it. So, which shouldn't be a surprise in a for-profit company. That's like being surprised that Chevrolet or Ford, you know, is going to make a car because that's their product, just like, you know, drugs are the product of pharma companies, are going to make something that makes them money. So there is a little bit of a give and take. And I think that sometimes pharma gets a little bit of a, I don't want to call it an evil rap because they have these tools and they are not making them available to the public, but they're for-profit companies. So I don't know why all the time that is such a shock, like you said, in for-profit medicine. Actually, it was kind of interesting to be a biotech exec during the COVID vaccine saga development program, because all of a sudden pharma got to be the hero of the story. You know, instead of the villains, and everybody was cheering on Moderna, cheering on Pfizer, cheering on J&J. Given the FDA trouble when they were taking too long and let these things out. I kept actually making the joke, everybody hates pharma until you need them. But I completely disagree with some of the pricing. I'm going to get into a little bit into reimbursement. So actually, let me say that antibiotics as a whole don't reimburse a lot. When you go to the pharmacy and you have medical insurance, the medical insurance is what pays the pharmacy for the price of that drug. And you sort of don't know typically what they're charging, but a lot of the times it's rather obscene. There are eczema drugs out there that cost $40,000. There are spine drugs out there for children that cost $2 million. And that's absolutely insane. I mean, no drug to treat spine disorders in children should be $2 million. But this gets political because it's medicine. It's as if you have a moral obligation to make it available to everybody at low cost or sometimes no cost. So it's a not-for-profit expectation being put on a for-profit company. Again, I agree. I don't want like pitchfork emojis being thrown at me that drug pricing can be obscene, but the way drug prices are actually determined in the US is a little bit of a mind-boggling concept. So just give me a moment to explain this to you. If you're developing a new drug and you want to figure out how much insurance companies are going to pay for it, you pay a consulting firm hundreds of thousands of dollars to take a bunch of insurance execs to a fancy hotel and convene what's called a payer congress. Have you heard of these things?
No.
So you take them to a fancy hotel in Texas, You get up on stage, you give a 20-minute PowerPoint with, wine and cheese and dinner, and you say, we think our drug should cost this. And most of the time the lobbying works. So one of the reasons why drug pricing is so obscene here is that the companies that make the drugs name the price. But insurance companies, by and large, in terms of antibiotics, don't want to pay very much. While that eczema drug might be $37,000, an antibiotic might be, say, $1,000. So they're not choosing to make products that make money, or they're not choosing to make products that don't make money. So unfortunately, we have a very imbalanced reimbursement system. And that
why is it that antibiotics get reimbursed at the lower cost?
I don't. It's a question I've asked before, and I don't want to claim that I completely know the answer.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has something to do with the fact that traditionally higher reimbursement products are ones that have, like a new molecule or something that the company had to invent, or, took 10 years of science to, fold this molecule onto another, and it's a new chemical that nobody's ever heard of before. Whereas antibiotics, like we said before, they don't have to invent them. They're not brand new. So it's kind of like we're just harvesting something that is not that unique. And that seems to affect the amount of money that they can demand. It doesn't make a ton of sense, but that just seems to be the effect.
And so there's a cost disincentive to develop new antibiotics. And is there anything else that stands in the way of developing new antibiotics?
You've got a lot of roadblocks for companies in developing new antibiotics. Like I said, there's reimbursement. Resistance is obviously a huge one, because you don't want to spend 4 or 5 years developing something that is already going to be useless in a year because the bugs are quicker. But also, there was a company actually a few years ago called Acagen. I don't know, you remember that company? So they were a publicly traded company that actually know people who lost a lot of money on. Actually, they had this new and wonderful UTI drug that the FDA approved, and their revenue predictions were huge, because this was supposed to be, the latest, greatest drug to treat urinary tract infections. And UTIs are hospitalizing like 47% of people now that get them. I mean, it's no longer just take a dose of Levaquin and go home. I mean, these are dangerous bugs now. They've mutated and they're a little bit more, scary than they were before. As soon as that new drug showed up at the hospital, what do you think the doctors did with it? What should they have done with it? This brand new drug?
Tried it out.
They locked it in a safe, because the second you start using that new antibiotic, you start creating resistance to it, and then you might lose it. So they actually did, in my opinion, the morally responsible thing. They don't have a consistently, innovative pipeline. They don't have new things coming out all the time where they can count on. It's okay if we lose this one, there's going to be another one following it. So you've got bad reimbursement, almost instantaneous resistance, and basically a medical moral obligation on the part of the doctors to save it in case it's a last resort, because you don't want to lose it. I mean, you're going to try out everything you can prior, all the old stuff, before you use the new one. So there's a lot of roadblocks to incentivize people to start creating new antibiotics. Mm-hmm. Also, that's affected, of course, investment dollars. There's a lot of investment funds out there, and there's thousands of them. And when you're starting a biotech company, a lot of times you have to go out and ask them for money for your idea. Show them your science, show them your concept, and say, please invest in me, I want to produce it. And if you go to these guys, it's on a basic level, just forget what we're talking about, and you say, I want to make this, but Economist magazine predicts that if I make it, I'm going to lose $50 million in the long run. They're probably not going to write you a check. Because their job is to send their capital off, like Mr. Wonderful says on Shark Tank, and have it come back as more, when that doesn't look like a strong likelihood in the case of antibiotics. It's a really bad intersection of just phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. And so can government incentives correct some of this, or are there other ways in which we could have some counter forces to these financial and biological barriers to making antibiotics?
Absolutely. So there are, I actually did a LinkedIn post the other day, and I even wrote this in my LinkedIn post. There are government incentive programs for companies to make drugs to treat rare diseases. So diseases that affect less than 200,000 people per year. There's also government incentive programs to make drugs for rare tropical diseases, they call them, which are things that are sort of still outside the US, but they're afraid that they may get here. So we want to give you perks, to make a drug for it. Why there's no antibiotic incentive programs, I'll never have any idea. But these orphan drug programs, if I wanted to make a drug for a rare disease, we're actually working on one, it's for shingles of the eye. When you submit for approval, you don't have to pay the $2.2 million review fee. Your clinical trials are 1/5 the normal size. All of your research and development is a tax write-off, on that product. And automatically, because it's a drug to treat a rare disease, insurance companies have agreed to reimburse more.
Mhm.
So I think there could be a little bit of a copy-paste phenomenon. We've got incentive programs for orphan drugs. I mean, we have a dry antibiotic pipeline. It's probably the scariest time in history in terms of resistance. And we've all seen what can happen if there's a bug that gets loose. I mean, wait till if that bug's like 75% fatal, and some of these, antibiotic resistant bacteria are. They should take those programs and put them on antibiotics. Tropical disease vouchers, these are wild. Have you heard about these expedited review vouchers? See, our strategy guy, Zach, I told him this the other day, and he couldn't believe this one. So if you go to FDA and you say, I want to study like a trachoma, which is a blinding tropical disease of the eye, and I've got an idea for a drug. It's a new chemical nobody's used before to treat this. I have a population of patients in Latin America. Please give me clearance to do a human trial. They say, sure, go do it. And here's what I call a golden ticket, which is a voucher that when you come back with your data and you submit it for approval, it cuts the review time in half. So it takes it from 12 months to 6 months. But here's the kicker. This is the funny part. That golden ticket is transferable. So if you're Pfizer and you've got a new erectile dysfunction drug that's going to make you, billions and billions of dollars, and you can get it to the market 6 months quicker, you're going to write a multi-$100 million check for that voucher. So again, there is another incentive program for antibiotics. Even if that voucher gets transferred and they use that to sort of monetize their investment, there is an option. There's also subsidies, in my opinion. I mean, there's so much money going out in stimulus packages right now. Why can't some of that go out to incentivize antibiotic development? And then, of course, and I don't mean to answer myself, there's this implied notion that these pharma companies make so much money they should put it in themselves. I don't disagree with that notion, by the way. I think they should take some of their profits and figure out a structure to funnel it into antibiotic development. Maybe even have like a nonprofit side of their for-profit business, and just recognizing that those things might not make money. Anyway, I don't want to wax too much about this. So in answer to your question of can the government do things to help with development, I think they already have existing programs that could be, copy pasted, for lack of a better term, onto antibiotics.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so are there other things so it's really interesting to get your perspective as from the pharmaceutical company side of how whether or not developing or discovering an antibiotic makes sense and bringing it to market makes sense. And from what I gather from you, it actually doesn't really make that much economic sense, even though the health needs are really dire and the risks are tremendous. Are there other aspects on the demand side that you see that could be the demand for antibiotics that could be addressed in terms of overuse, misuse, inappropriate use of antibiotics?
Well, it's ironic as a question because we want to create less demand, as a goal. So from an economic perspective, I'd say that's probably not incentivizing, but from a behavioral and sociologic perspective, it's absolutely necessary. We have terrible habits. We should not be demanding. You've done research on I think I've seen videos in that class that you taught where people go to the doctor and they demand certain drugs, and there's just a behavior paradigm that happens between patients and doctors. And there's this, what do I have to lose mentality of the doctor? The antibiotic's not going to hurt them, but I don't want a patient that's angry at me. I don't want a negative Yelp review or something like that. So we have to start with recognizing that we don't need antibiotics all the time as a population. And as soon as we recognize that and take that small step, maybe it'll affect our immediate, impulsive behavior to say, oh my God, I need a Z-Pack. My stomach hurts, I need a Z-Pack. My ear hurts, I need a Z-Pack. I have to make that change. So in terms of affecting how we as a population reduce demand, absolutely. There's also, there's obviously a lot of talk about, using antibiotics in meat production, but 80%, like I think I mentioned before, of antibiotic use in the United States goes into meat packing in farms. And they don't use it there to, treat disease. They use it there to prevent them from getting disease while they're fattening them up on these farms, because they're dirty environments. So I think maybe we could, stop the meat industry from using antibiotics, I mean, that'd be a heck of a place to start. You just knock 80% right off the top there. I mean, obviously, if there's a sick animal, just like if there's a sick person, you should be able to use them. But maybe some demonstrable need could be useful. We talked when you and I were in that course together about the CARES Act a lot. The CARES Act has, opioid surveillance programs. It has, different forms that are required to actually go to the doctor and actually pick up, or go to the pharmacist and pick up an opiate. I had a bunch of dental work recently, and the doctor tried to give me a codeine prescription, and I took it to the pharmacy, and the script didn't have some serial number on the top, so they wouldn't give it to me. I had to go back to the doctor. They hadn't updated some code in their CARES Act system. I actually just gave up. It wasn't even worth it because it was too much work. So while I don't think it should be that hard to get a Z-Pak, just like in terms of opioids, there are surveillance and restriction programs in place for overuse of certain products, but it's hard a little bit, just sort of instinctually to compare opiates to antibiotics, because like Fleming said, you can't overdose antibiotics, but you can overdose on opiates. The problem is you can overdose the population, you can overdose, I'll just call it the microbial universe, and you end up with, as the WHO has predicted now, by 2050, you could have 10 million people dying per year of antibiotic resistant infections. That's a scary number, and less than 30 years away, by the way.
So another strike against developing antibiotics from a pharmaceutical perspective, we're trying to think like a pharmaceutical company, is that the entire public health movement is towards reducing usage.
Absolutely. And
you're trying to kill your own market, basically.
Yeah, we want to reduce demand. But at the same time, we want to increase the pipeline. It is an interesting just framework to think about it like that. I haven't even thought about it in that way before. We want to increase supply and reduce demand. It's not a good model for a for-profit company, admittedly. If I went to my board of directors and said, I want to go and do only things that have no demand, they'd probably fire me. But you and I have talked in the past, and I don't think I've ever actually asked you this point blank. Do you think the government should nationalize antibiotic production? I want to flip the question on you. I'm curious.
Well, I think you're much deeper into that kind of world than I am, but there's definitely something to be said for this being a public good. And I mean, I think if one of the lessons we have learned from COVID is that a strong government response in terms of these pharmaceutical developments can have tremendous payoff for population health. And I think if we come to the conclusion that developing antibiotics doesn't really make any economic or biological sense for a pharmaceutical company, then maybe we're going to reach a point where governments have to incentivize this in ways that they haven't done yet. And I think we're sort of, and that's the reason for having this panel. We're sort of at the edge of a ravine, and we can sort of see what the future is going to be, and what do we do at this particular point. And I think what you explained to us is that the supply side is the deck is stacked against the supply side. There's just not really that much that lines up in terms of companies going gung-ho and developing more antibiotic drugs. At the same time, we see more and more antibiotic resistance. And if these two become too far apart, we are going to have to do something one way or another, because as you have made it very clear, we don't want to go back to the 1900s and have the captains of that being tuberculosis, pneumonia, sore throats, scratches, and people die, and seeing a big drop in life expectancy. Yeah. So from a sociological perspective, it's also interesting is sort of like looking at the demand side. And some of my colleagues here at UCLA have done some research, and you hinted at some of it. My colleague Tanya Stivers has done research on parents of young children going to primary care physicians with kids with sore throats, and seeing how they make the case for antibiotics. And what she finds is that there are very few parents who are going to go in there and say explicitly, we want antibiotics. It almost never happens. But what they do is they describe symptoms, or they accentuate the seriousness of the symptoms in such a way that it sends a very strong message that they seem to be fishing for antibiotics. And then the other thing that parents might do, is bringing in extenuating circumstances, telling that they're just about to go on vacation and the child should be healthy to go on vacation. And then, as you mentioned, from your own mother's perspective, is like, why not take antibiotics? But what the study of patient-doctor interaction shows is that physicians can sort of offset this subtle pressure by foreshadowing that antibiotics are not on offer, and by narrating, providing commentary during the physical exam, and sort of describing the findings and making clear that they are not really indications for antibiotics. So there are some subtle things we can do in even patient-doctor communication that might help, but it seems that this is a much bigger problem than that can be solved by focusing just on patient-doctor interaction. And I think the experience of countries like Sweden, which has a very low antibiotics use, shows that you really need a societal effort. You cannot just focus on one player in the pharmaceutical industry or physicians or the general public to do the right thing. You need to really throw a lot of resources behind it. So I do think this is one of the areas where in the future we might need a stronger response. This is not something that we can just let the market take care of it and see where we end up.
I can tell you, I don't think the private sector is going to take care of this. And I can sit in this, interesting chair where, I believe that drugs like antibiotics and even, eczema drugs that are $37,000 shouldn't be that much. I believe that they should be available for all, but I'm also CEO of a for-profit company. So I recognize the fact that I have to make a profit because I have employees who, have mortgages. And at the same time, I want to offset that with my desire to, to do good. But if you only do good, it's hard to pay the mortgage, sometimes. So there is a little bit of a balance. But I don't have a ton of faith in the private sector to do it right now. So in terms of combining efforts with the government and the private sector, like you said, the vaccine development program was an absolutely amazing display of the government partnering with private sector, partnering with industry, and letting pharma do what they are good at, which is invent new drugs. I mean, that's what they do. The government does their thing, pharma does their thing. So I think if we could have sort of a joint effort, and I don't think we have a lot of time, I don't want to say that this is a decade away, 2 decades away. And I'm not just trying to be dramatic by saying that. Like, it's freaky, the bugs that are out there right now. There's stories of people that have been in UCLA hospital even recently where they're 2 doors down from somebody, they cough once, and this, completely resistant Pseudomonas bug gets to the other person 2 doors away, and then they both die. I mean, that's now. And that's not in a remote area in the middle of a third world country. That's UCLA. So they're out there. We've all seen articles about superbug outbreaks, from colonoscopy scopes and Candida auris, the 75% fatal resistant fungus that they found in a woman's ear in Japan. I actually was working on that for a bit. There needs to be a hurry. And interestingly, if you look at that old term, acquisition cost, customer acquisition cost, I don't want to use that for this scenario, but there's never been more of a heightened awareness for infectious disease than there is right now. I mean, never before was, just sort of a suburban, family in the middle of, the Midwest looking at their phones and checking the latest infectious disease stats. Like, that's new. That's what COVID did, is it created an incredible amount of awareness of what an organism, something we can't see, something that's 1/200th the size of a human hair, can do to our lives. And I do think that it has affected psychology dramatically. I don't think that masks are going to go away completely. I think that people are going to probably stop shaking hands and start fist pumping. I think that there are going to be some behaviors that stay. Maybe one of those should be government partnering with industry, to get ahead of this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to have another COVID, but with a much deadlier bug.
Yeah. Well, that's and what do you think? Besides industry, government, and the medical profession, what can ordinary people do, people who have kids that are having ear infections? What is their responsibility?
It actually reminds me a little bit of the wear a mask to protect your neighbor phenomenon that we went through. You have to realize that at some point that person that needs the antibiotic could be you. If you incubate, if you take antibiotics and teach an organism to be resistant to it, it sends out in the world and then you've got a whole new bug. It could come back to you. It's not an unlikely concept. So you have to get out of the headspace that, you know, I need this now, or I might need this now, and it's okay. Like, it's not going to affect me if I do it, because it could. I mean, it's not like COVID where you don't have it, but you can give it to somebody else, but you still don't have it. It's you're creating it and releasing it out in the world to do its thing where it's going to keep multiplying. So I think, you know, what can people do? What can parents do that want their kids to get a Z-Pak or amoxicillin every single time they have a scratchy throat? It's before you see definitive symptoms of an infection, which is probably everybody should educate themselves a little bit on what an actual infection looks like. Things like a fever, elevated pulse, the usual signs of infection. Just a sore knee or a sore ear doesn't mean you actually have a clinical infection. Should try and let the immune system do its thing a little bit. Some time, you know, if you've got a healthy young person, you know, they usually can fight their way through, you know, a little bit of a scraped knee or a minor ear infection. Again, if they get to the point where they're clinically infected, please take them to the doctor, get them the drugs they need, take the whole course. And yeah, I mean, what can we do as a society? Oh my God, we can,
Well,
what an infection looks like. I would say it's a good place to start.
If I put on my sociological hat again, I think there's also some indirect things we can do. We could also invest more in paid sick leave for families.
Yeah.
That when your child does get sick, you don't have to make a choice between losing your job and getting a very quick antibiotic treatment so that you can continue. So I think, and that's another thing we have learned from COVID, that paid sick leave can really make a world of difference in taming these kind of very broad public health crisis.
It's hard as a parent, though, to hear, you know, let your kid get a little sicker.
Yeah.
You know, they'll figure it out. Like, it may take an extra couple of days, but they'll get through it. And it's for the greater good. It's hard to hear.
It's hard to hear, but it's really at the core of this entire situation is the fact that something that can be not harmful for you can be harmful for the rest of the society. And that's really, I mean, ultimately, this entire antibiotic crisis has a sociological core to it, in the sense that it's a level of solidarity between the individual and the community of which they're part, and the individual doing a good thing that benefits everyone else.
I wonder nowadays, with the ability to share information and sort of call people out on things that they're doing, which seems to happen a lot more often, if the cure for cancer came out, and I keep using this example because I can't think of a better simile than the cure for cancer than the cure for infection back in the 1940s. If people just started squandering it, knowing full well that the experts were saying, you're going to lose it in no time, you know, would we punish those people? You know, if not by, not by, jailing them, but even just by sentiment, I think we might. You know, and I'm not entirely certain why we are not doing the same thing with antibiotics, you know, so that's a psychological and a sociological phenomenon that we've haphazardly taken for granted, something that at the time was as important a miracle as a cure for cancer.
Yeah.
You know, so I almost think we need a reset. We need a fresh supply of new antibiotics, not just like one or two. I think we need, you know, another pipeline. When that doctor needs to know that if he has one new antibiotic, it's not the last one he's going to get before he retires. So an incentive program to get industry to start making new ones. You have to kickstart the whole pipeline, though, not just, you know, one company to make one. In combination with a lower demand, you know, all being bolstered by, you know, some government support, recognizing that this is going to be a massive sociologic, economic, and, you know, just humanitarian problem. You know, if it's not already, it's going to be very soon.
Yes, and it's better that we take preventative measures rather than trying to fix it when it's out of control. You know, there's a lot of parallels here with the the COVID epidemic and the much slower development of variants versus antibiotic resistance. Of course, it's bacteria versus viruses, but there's a lot of similar kind of elements, and we did get at least, I mean, there's a story of hope here as well, in the sense that we at least got some of a handle on the COVID epidemic, at least in the United States. And so maybe there's a way that we can learn from these lessons and carry that forward in addressing the antibiotic crisis.
I just keep saying in my own head and to people around me, COVID was a formidable enemy, because as a virus, it was very efficient at what it did. You know, the virus's job is to, you know, hide and spread. And it's not like Ebola where it, you know, killed its host in a week. I mean, it's a very efficient virus at hiding and spreading, sometimes unknown, but overall its mortality rate was still not super high. Mm-hmm. You know, obviously it killed way too many people, but that was a factor of how many people it spread to. So you had just sort of that, you know, supply, you know, in terms of how many people it hit. But if we're faced with an airborne bacteria, you know, like pan-resistant Pseudomonas, the one I mentioned before, which means nothing works on it, that is 75 to 90% fatal. Imagine taking COVID and replacing it with that, and then not having the tools in place. You know, treat it. It's terrifying, and it's not an over-dramatized example. You know, these bugs exist, and they're airborne. They're not just on handles or, you know, in the hospital when you're there. They're in the environment. Mm-hmm. So we need to get ahead of this.
Yeah. Well, Brad, it was really amazing and extraordinarily insightful to get your perspective from the industry and the sociology side on the antibiotics crisis. I thank everyone who joined us, watching us, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and I wish you a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.